Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to Thursday. Welcome to Thursday. It's kind of a misty, rainy day in Vancouver here, as is often the case. Maybe I'll grow to love it, who knows. Um, I'll say hello. So Unadi is here. Good morning, Unadi. Jesse's here. Good morning, Jesse. Kayla's here. Good morning, Kayla. And I think that's Arad. I think that's him. Good morning. Um, okay, let's jump into where we were. So today we'll finish off racism here, and I may have something else to show you after that. I'm just trying to decide what I should show you after the break, but I will show you something after the break. So yesterday we were talking about this whole thing, right? And of course I gave you a little bit of background saying that this statue here is of a Confederate general in the United States. People were debating about whether, in fact, that statue should continue to stand there, as this Confederate general, basically fought to try to continue to keep his slaves, right? And that's not something that that's not something we think is cool anymore, right? So in the discussions of taking this statue down, we saw a lot of people have very strong opinions, right? Some people, of course, wanted it taken down, and then others we saw showed up to protest against it. And of course, they had lots of things that they were seemingly angry at, right? And so we watched that report from Vice News, and that Vice reporter, I'm sorry, I don't know what her name is, but she kind of got in the middle of that whole thing and interviewed everyone and tried to kind of figure out what they were doing and what they were thinking. And, we heard a mix of a lot of things, I think. I asked you some questions here, about what ideologies these white supremacists were expressing. And, most of them were, of course, they were white supremacists, right? So they were, supportive of white people, and they were kind of, they didn't want non-white people in their country, right? And they blamed non-white people for, basically all the problems, right? And so they kind of have this view of America of the past as this perfect place, right? This perfect, white picket fences, and it's very peaceful, and it's very kind of, it's almost like a sitcom where everything is kind of perfect. They have this idea that, that was America in the past, and then all these immigrants came and everything went downhill, right? And of course, that's not really the way it was. America was never this ideal, perfect place, and it was certainly never an exclusively white place. There were non-white people in America all the way back to the very beginning, and so they're kind of imagining a past that didn't really happen. But they're also kind of pushing back, and they kind of envision this as sort of a conspiracy, right? They think the state is involved. They think people on the left are involved. Some people think it's, there's Jewish people involved, and communists and Bolsheviks, and the bourgeoisie, which is a kind of Karl Marx term. All of these things are kind of mixed together, right? And the idea here is that they're under attack, by all of these forces, and they have to fight to survive, right? And again, I think they're wrong. I don't think that's the case. They're not really under threat. Again, white people remain a dominant group in the United States. They have historical power. They control most social institutions and social messaging. They're not really under threat at all, right? To answer this fourth question about why the statue is causing so much controversy, I think it's a catalyst, right? It's a thing that gets people fired up, and once people are fired up, they start kind of pushing back and yelling about the things that upset them the most, right? And so, you know, the this kind of rally and protest around the statue, I don't think it's just about the statue, right? It's about a lot of things, right? And some of those things are not legitimate, right? Like white people being under attack. That's just not really true. Some of those things are not legitimate. Some of them are, and we haven't really talked about this. And I don't want to. I don't want to kind of excuse these guys' behavior, but for a lot of people in the United States, they have been left behind, right? And economically they have been left behind. I don't know how much detail I want to go into here, but for a long time, for most of the 20th century, the U.S. and Canada were manufacturing hubs, right? So lots and lots of things were manufactured in the United States and Canada, and as a result, the U.S. became quite wealthy. They had a high standard of living, right? They had lots of things, right? They had cars and toasters and vacuum cleaners and all kinds of things like this. And most of these manufacturing jobs didn't really require any kind of education, right? So people young men mostly, could come out of high school, finish high school, get a factory job, often at the same factory that their father and their grandfather worked at, and they could work there for their entire career. Good morning. They could work there for their entire career. They could retire when they were 55. And in the process, they could provide for their family. They could usually buy a house, raise a couple of kids comfortably, and they'd be fine, right? It was a nice, easy kind of transition from school into work, into retirement. And, you could provide for a family that way. But that's not really how it is anymore, right? Where's everything made today? China, right? Everything is made in China, right? All of those manufacturing jobs have gone to other countries, right? Countries where labor and production are cheaper. And so what's happened is that all of those people who were in the middle class of the US and who worked those manufacturing jobs, their jobs all went off somewhere else, and most of them wound up falling down the ladder, okay? They didn't go up. Some of them did. But a lot of them slid down, right? And they wound up in kind of service industry positions or transportation or driving or taxis or whatever. And so their quality of life and the amount of money they made sort of declined, right? So I think part of what we're seeing here from these guys is they've kind of been left behind economically, right? There was a way in which their fathers and their grandfathers were able to be successful, right? Not a lot of education, but they just got a factory job and worked hard and they were successful. And now that doesn't really work anymore, right? They have less opportunities unless they are able to go to university and sort of get advanced training. They're kind of stuck in the lower part of the economic structure of the U.S., right? And, I think a lot of them feel that they are, something was taken away from them, right? That they lost something. Something was stolen from them. Something that should have been theirs is now not theirs anymore. And so they need someone to blame for that, right? And sometimes it's the government, sometimes it's immigrants, sometimes it's people of color. There's all kinds of reasons, but yeah, things have kind of changed in the United States. Not really for the better, I think, for a lot of people in terms of their economic picture. Things have not gotten better for them, and they're angry about it, right? And so this is kind of one, I think, manifestation of that anger. And again, I don't think it shouldn't be about race, because we know race is not really a biological thing. We also know that white people are not really under attack. We know that they're not really disadvantaged as a whole. But I think what's happening here is, in part, these guys come from families that would have been successful had they been born, 50 years earlier. They would have been more successful. But in this kind of economic climate and in this time and place, they're not successful, but they feel like they should be. Right? They feel like that something is owed to them that they didn't get. Right? And again, I guess I'm sympathizing a little bit, but I shouldn't. But I think that's really more what it's about, right? Is that these guys have been left behind by the economy, and they want to find someone to blame for that, and so they're going to blame people of color, right? And it's not the fault of people of color, right? People of color have nothing to do with this, really, right? I don't know. What do you think about that? Does that make sense? And again, I want to explain, but I don't want to apologize for these guys, right? Because there's, I don't sympathize with them. It should be said, I do not sympathize with them. I don't like what they're saying. I think what we saw was horrible and, gross, and yeah, I don't want to see any of that. But I think it's also important at the same time, you can condemn someone's behavior, which I am, but it's also a good idea to sometimes try to figure out why they're doing what they're doing, right? What is the motivation of these people to act in this way, right? And yes, maybe they're all bad people, right? And that's possible, but that doesn't really get us very far, right? In terms of figuring out why this is happening, right? These people are a bunch of bad people. Well, then there's not really much you can do, right? If you just assume they're bad, right? You kind of need to understand a little better what's happening. And I think in part that's part of what's happening here, is that some of these guys have been left behind by the economy. Things haven't really gotten better for most Americans, right? And in fact, what's really happened is that the poor have gotten poorer, the rich have gotten richer, and the people who used to be in the middle, well, there's just not that many of them anymore, right? And that's not really, for most people, that's not an improvement, right? And in that way, it's true that things were economically better in the past, right? And they are more difficult in the present. So anyway, maybe that's all I want to say about that. I don't want to sympathize with these guys, because I really don't. But I think there is an explanation for some of this behavior, and I think that explanation is economic. It's not a race issue. It's an economic issue, but it is showing up as a race issue, I would say, anyway. Okay, so we saw this in the video. We saw that there was this rally at the park around the statue. We saw some chanting. We saw a subsequent protest. So one of those, the first one we saw was in May. The next one we saw was in July. There was some violence, as you saw. People were getting tear gassed and maced and things like that to break them up. And then we saw another rally. So that was a series of 3 events. But at the last one, we saw that a young woman was killed, right? A car drove into a crowd and injured a bunch of people and killed one woman, right? And so, again, this is evidence that, race is not real, right? Race is not a biological reality. But if people believe it is, it makes a difference, right? And for Heather here, it resulted in her death, right? The fact that people believe race is real. So just to kind of tie up this particular topic, I just wanted to share some stats with you, right? So again, we said that when we look at oppression like racism, we want to look at societal-wide patterns, right? We don't want to look at individual situations, right? We don't want to look at one-on-one encounters. Yes, people can be racist. They can do racist things. They can say racist things. They can discriminate on a racial basis. But really what helps us understand what's going on in society is to look at the numbers, right? So again, have a look at this life expectancy in the US, right? On average, it's almost about 80 years, but if you look at the difference between, let's say, white males and black males, black people don't live as long, right? And the same thing for black women. They don't live as long either, right? By a difference of 3 or 4 years. That's kind of a big deal, right? These are really big data sets, right? This isn't a sample. This is the official statistics of everyone who died in the United States over the past, 5 years. That's a lot of people, right? That's a big number. And so, yeah, why do we have this difference? Why do we have a significant difference in how long people live? Right? If you look at the economy, right? So again, if you look at who has money in households, you'll see that of an average household income of $53,000, white people, and in this case Asian people, are doing much, much better, right? Black people, Hispanics, they're doing much, much worse, right? And again, this is a big statistic. This is a measure of the entire country. There's 323 million people in the United States.
That's in USD?
I think it is in USD. So that's a big difference, right? And it doesn't explain anything, right? It doesn't tell us why things are the way they are, but it does tell us that there's a big difference, right? And so the color of your skin, the race you belong to, seems to have some effect on how much money you make. That's interesting to know. Yes, Dunya? Is it like Canada? There's a lot of. Is it multicultural?
Yeah, a lot of
Yes, yes, it is.
Like, I don't see. Maybe in Burnaby it's like this or this, but I don't see on it's more about international.
Yeah, well, as in most cases, it depends on where you go, right? So, like if you went to Surrey, for instance, you'll see far more Indian people, right? If you go to Richmond, you'll see far more Chinese people, right? And so if you go to Kamloops or Kelowna, which is in the interior of BC, it's not as multicultural there. It's much more multicultural here. So it kind of depends on the place you go to. Some places are very white, some places are not. On the whole, I would say that the U.S. is probably as multicultural as we are. The proportions of the population that are black or Hispanic or Asian or whatever, those are different. But I would suggest that, that's a good question, because the U.S. is very multicultural, but I feel that Canada's immigration policy is more open. Like we're admitting more immigrants. So that's a good question. I don't know for sure. But actually, I know that. Gosh, what is the statistic? I think in Canada it's something like 1 in 7 people. No, that's not it. I can't even remember the statistic, but it's a very high number of people who live in Canada who were not born here, right? So we do have a big multicultural population. We do have a lot of people who, were not born in Canada who have recently come. The Canadian government is trying to attract, I think, 300,000 immigrants this year. So And I think my perception is that Canada has been much better in terms of welcoming refugees, for sure.
Yeah, because that what happened to me here.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was like a sponsorship from my family here. They've
Yeah.
been here for so long and they brought us.
Yeah.
But the government let them, so they sponsored us, but the government also like helped us,
Yeah.
like aid.
Yeah. And I think, and I'm not positive about this, but I think the Canadian government has been much better about that, about making space for refugees, about funding programs to bring over refugees or the children of refugees or the parents of refugees. Again, we're trying to bring in a lot of immigrants every year. So I think Canada is kind of more open that way, but I don't have the data to support it, but I kind of think that's the case. Yeah. But yeah, there's a difference, right? And again, the numbers here don't tell us why, right? They just tell us what. But I think that's kind of worth looking at, don't you? That black households are making, just slightly more than half of white households. That's worth looking at, right? Is it racism? I don't know, but that's a pretty big difference, and those are pretty big numbers, right? So this is a clear pattern in society. Why is that, right? If you look at people living in poverty, right? So where you draw the poverty line kind of varies in societies, but usually it's if you're below the poverty line, you cannot afford basic food and shelter and clothing. Okay? Somehow you do not have enough money to meet those three needs. Okay? And so as you can see in the US, that's a big number, isn't it? 14% of people. So 46 million people in the United States do not have enough money for food, shelter, and clothing. And I mean basic food, shelter, and clothing. That's kind of concerning, don't you think? It's a lot of people, right? But if you look at how this breaks out in terms of race, you'll see that you are far more likely to live in poverty if you are a black or Hispanic person. And you are much less likely to live in poverty if you are white, right? And if you are Asian. So again, the numbers don't tell us why this is happening, but they do tell us what's happening, right? And so people living in poverty are much more likely to be black and Hispanic, right? We talked about this before with Indigenous people, but look at the incarceration rate. So how many people are in prison? So white men make up 64% of the population of the United States, in terms of men anyway. White people are about 64%. But they're only about 39% of the population in prison. Okay? But if you look at black men, for instance, they're only 13% of the population, and yet they're 40% of people in jail. Right? They are very overrepresented in the criminal justice system. Right? Why is that? Right? Why are black people either committing more crime, or why are they winding up in jail more often than white people? Right? And even just this past week, did anyone follow or read about the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse?
Oh, I've seen that one.
Yeah. A lot of people were complaining very loudly because he was found not guilty, right? And a lot of people stood up and said, oh, this is awful. It's because he's white that he wasn't convicted. That's a long story that we won't go into right now. But yeah, there's a big difference here, right? And so, again, what are some explanations? And some people might be very tempted to look at this through a particular lens. And again, this is the importance of theory, right? The things that you believe, right? The theories that you use to figure things out determine kind of what you see, right? Or how you interpret things. So many people might be tempted to use kind of a cultural deficit theory kind of approach, right? Wow, there's lots of black people living in poverty. Wow, there's lots of black people in prison. It must be their fault, right? There must be something about them or about their culture that, has resulted in this. And that's, of course, what those white supremacists believe, right? There's crime perpetrated by black people. There's black people living in poverty. There's black people in jail. Must be something wrong with them, right? They must be bad somehow, right? That's what this cultural deficit theory might suggest, right? But again, we've been talking a lot about the effects of racism, right? And the U.S. has dealt with racism for basically its entire life as a country, right? The country started out as, its economy was based on slave labor, right? And those slaves were black Africans brought over to work as slaves, right? So the U.S. has been a racist country for a long time, right? And it continues to grapple with that past, right? And that grappling with the past, trying to figure out what it means and how it's affecting the present is exactly what happened at that rally, right? That statue was a symbol of history, right? And people are looking at it, trying to figure out how to understand that history, right? What should we take from that history? Right? And again, I think what we can say here at least is that, when you have a country that is founded on racism, right? When you socially construct race as a way to advantage some people and disadvantage others, well, that's going to have a lot of negative effects, right? And those effects are going to kind of ripple through time, right? And so, the United States, slavery was abolished in 1865, right? What is that, 150 years ago, give or take? But
I think slightly.
a little more, 166?
156, I think.
Yeah. 156 years ago, slavery was abolished, yet still dealing with the effects, right? 165 years later. Same thing here in Canada, right? Indigenous people were treated very poorly by the government starting 100 or so years ago, but kind of continuing up to today. And those issues don't go away, right? People don't just get over them, right? They are embedded in the way that society works. They're embedded in people's heads and how they think about things. And we continue to kind of suffer from them, right? Yeah. And so many people of color in Canada, but also in the US, we see that they have underfunded schools. One of the things that comes up in the US a lot is that schools are funded by property taxes from the neighborhood around the school, right? So if you live in a poor neighborhood and you send your kid to the school there, that school is being funded by the property taxes of the houses around the school. If it's a poor neighborhood, are the property taxes high or low? They're low, right? So that means that there's not a lot of funding for the school. School doesn't get good funding, doesn't get good equipment, doesn't get good teachers, kids don't get a good education, right? That means if you come from a poor neighborhood, it doesn't matter how smart you are, you're not going to get a great education, right? While the people who live in the fancy neighborhood, property taxes are higher, their schools have more funding, they send their kids to that better funded school, those kids get a better education, right? So if you're born into a poor family, you might stay there because your education's not going to be that great, If you're born into a rich family, you're going to get a really good education and you'll have a better chance at being rich yourself. Right? Again, poor access to health care. This isn't as big a deal in Canada, although there's some issues, but in the US, they don't have universal health care like we do. You have to buy your own health insurance. And of course, the Affordable Care Act, and called Obamacare because President Obama brought it in, that helped things out a little bit. But still, poor people have worse access to health care than rich people. And I think that's a problem, right? How much money you have shouldn't determine whether you live or die, right? Oh, I need a kidney transplant, but I'm not super wealthy, so I guess I'm gonna die. Right? That's not acceptable to me, right? That's not acceptable to me. But it is to a lot of Americans, right? Because they feel that people should take care of themselves, and if you want your health taken care of, then buy appropriate health insurance. But of course, you need money to do that. There's some other things that are kind of implicated here in terms of black people getting generational wealth, right? So being approved for mortgages or business loans or things like that. It's difficult to get ahead when nobody will give you a mortgage or a business loan. And again, there's unequal treatment that's been demonstrated in basically every social institution, right? And so when you kind of add all these things up, you're not looking at, there's something wrong with them, right? It's that there's something wrong with the system, right? They are, it's like the board game analogy that I've used a couple times. Everybody's playing the same game, but some people have different rules, right? Some people start out with more money. Some people get to roll the dice more often or have more dice, right? Some people don't have to suffer the same consequences of, pulling the wrong card or winding up in jail as others do, right? And so everybody's trying to play the game, but some people have an easier time. Yeah, and so we're not looking at flawed cultures here. We're looking at systemic racism, right? And I just kind of wanted to end it off with this because this person said it much better than I could. And I won't read it, but I'll let you read it here.
It's adult words, so I don't really understand some of the words.
It's true. There are some big words there, right?
My English is still primary level English.
No, it's not. It's better than that, Eunice. But you can see what he's saying here is that it's some of the same things we've said all along, right? Is that when you're living in a system that is based on racism, when that's how the machine of society works, it doesn't really matter whether you like it or not. It doesn't matter if you approve. It doesn't matter how much you like people of other colors. It doesn't matter, right? Because the system is set up in a way to advantage some people and disadvantage others, right? And so he's saying here that unfortunately, it takes a lot of work to sort of push back against these social ideas and to change social institutions. That's difficult, right? But that's the work that we kind of have to do. Okay, so shall we take a little break? Okay, let's take a break, come back, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about economic inequality, I think. Okay? All right. Okay, people, and we're back. So I'm going to get rid of that. We're not going to talk about ancient Greece, I promise, because that would make no sense at all. But I will talk to you a little bit about economic inequality or classism. So this is usually where the course ends. Interestingly, we're a little bit behind somehow. I don't really know how we got there, but I haven't managed to get as much into this course as I normally can. But maybe I think we had a lot of holidays this term, it seems, and days off, so maybe that had something to do with it. But either way, this is kind of where I end the course, talking about classism and talking about economic inequality. So, the first thing. So when we talk about class here, what we're talking about is people's kind of rank in society. Okay, so sometimes that can have to do, a lot of times that has to do with economics, right? How much money people have. Sometimes it can have to do with what family you come from. So in some countries, certain families are very rich, but also very kind of prestigious, and they kind of have a history, if you will. Sometimes it can have to do with status that we've given people. So celebrities fall into this category, right? People who are, they might be rich, right? And they might even come from a prominent family, but sometimes they're celebrities for other reasons, right? They're actors, they're musicians, they're models, whoever they are, right? So all of these things can kind of factor into where people sit in society, right? Either closer to the top or closer to the bottom, right? And the difference here in terms of socioeconomic class has to do with power, okay? And it's important, or it's useful to think about power in three types of power, okay? So here we have three people, right? Do you recognize all of these people?
Not the one in the middle.
Not the one in the middle? Okay, so who's on the far left? Okay, well, who's on the far right?
Justin Trudeau.
Justin Trudeau, right? Canada's Prime Minister. On the far left, it's yep, Bill Gates, right? So Bill Gates is the founder of Microsoft, right? And so he's worth about $70 kajillion or something like that.
Wow.
He's worth a lot. The guy in the middle is the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama is kind of the head of Buddhism worldwide. He's also kind of somewhat of a political leader for the country of Tibet, although he's had to flee Tibet because of China's pressure. But my point here is that these three guys are very powerful, but they're powerful in different ways, right? So Bill Gates here has financial power, right? He can, actually, I'm going to step back. When we talk about power, in a sociological way, power is the ability to get something that you want when other people want something different, okay? That's power. So again, my classic example of this is that tomorrow we are having a quiz, right? You may not want one, but we're having one, right? So, and we're having one because I have power in that way, right? I can set a quiz tomorrow and I can give it, and it's happening, and there's nothing you can do about it. Sorry, but that's the point, right? Is that I have the power to make that happen. You guys might want something different, but I have the power to do it anyway, right? And so people with power are like that, right? They're able to do things that they want to do or make certain things happen, whether other people want them to happen or not. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's kind of a sociological definition. So Bill Gates here can make things happen. He can make a lot of things happen because he's wildly wealthy. He has a lot of money. He can do all kinds of things. Okay? Now, the Dalai Lama here has a different kind of power. He has social power. Turns out he's quite rich as well. But it's not his wealth that makes him powerful, right? It's the fact that he is the leader of a world religion, right? And even if you're not a Buddhist, people tend to respect what the Dalai Lama says. They kind of see him as a wise person, as kind of a man of peace. And so he has a lot of, he has a lot of street cred, if you will, right? People respect him because of who he is, okay? And that's powerful, right? When the Dalai Lama says something, people listen to him. And then on the right, of course, we have Justin Trudeau, right? And Justin Trudeau has political power. He is the Prime Minister of Canada. That's a very powerful position in the Canadian government. Well, it's the most powerful position in the Canadian government. Trudeau also has a little bit of social power too, right? Because he comes from the Trudeau family, right? His father was Prime Minister in the 1970s and 1980s, so people kind of know his name, they know that family. His family has money as well, right? He's not Bill Gates rich or anything like that, but his family has some cash. So he's got a little bit of financial power. He's got some social power too because of his name and because of his father, but most of his power is political, right? He's powerful because he's Prime Minister of Canada, right? So people have different types of power, right, that they can use to accomplish their goals, right? And so again, in this kind of social hierarchy, there are people at the top who have maybe some combination of those three things, and then there are people at the bottom who have less of those things, right? So yeah, when we're talking about classism, we're talking about this. We're talking about people who are at the top of the socioeconomic ladder in an oppressive relationship with people below them, right? So here, the rich, the 1%, if you will, they're often referred to as that. The 1% they have power, right? They're able to create and influence society in ways that benefit them at the expense of all of us at the bottom, right? People at the top generally control resources, right? They own things, they own companies, they own land, they own resources, right? And those of us at the bottom tend to sell our time or our labor or our expertise in order to make a living, right? So in some ways we're kind of, in some ways we rely on each other, right? Because people who own things need people to work for them, right? Jeff Bezos owns Amazon. He needs a lot of people to work for him in order to make Amazon work. But similarly, a lot of people need Amazon to exist so that they can earn a living and get a paycheck, right? So there's kind of there's a partnership here, right? We rely on each other, but also one side is definitely exploiting the other, right? One side has a lot more power and a lot more ability to kind of do the things that they want to do. So just like other forms of inequality, just like other oppressions, classism persists because of ideologies and beliefs, right? So we often think that people are somehow better because of their social standing, right? We've said this before, we look up to people with money, don't we? People who are rich, we kind of look up to them. We give them a lot of prestige, we give them a lot of status, we give them a lot of respect, right? Celebrities are the same way, right? Once people are famous, people tend to fall all over themselves trying to please the famous person, even if they're famous for nothing at all, which some people are, right? Some people are famous just for being famous, and yet, they get a lot of kind of status and power, right? Breeding has something to do with it as well, right? If you come from a prestigious family, right? Here in Canada, we don't really have too many of those families. Trudeau might be almost one of the only ones. In the United States, the Kennedys are a prestigious family,
Who's that? Oh,
like John F. Kennedy comes from that family.
that's the airport.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, named after the airport. But his family is quite prestigious. They have money. They've been very kind of socially prominent. They've been politically prominent, right? John F. Kennedy was president of the United States in the 1960s. Robert F. Kennedy was Secretary of State. A number of other Kennedys have run for public office. So they're kind of a big deal. They're a dynasty, if you will. But we kind of have this idea that those people are somehow better, right? That they're more intelligent, that they are more, that they're just better, right? In all kind of, by all measures, people at the top are better. And again, that helps to hold classism in place, right? Because if you feel that the people at the top of the social pyramid are better, that kind of implies that they deserve to be there, right? Of course they're up there, right? Of course Elon Musk is at the top of the social ladder because he's just better and just smarter than everyone else, right? By a long shot. And again, maybe that's true and maybe it's not. But if we believe that everyone who's at the top of that social ladder is better than us, and they deserve to be there, then there's no reason to question the social pyramid, right? If we truly believe that brown-eyed kids are smarter than blue-eyed kids, and then we look at the test scores and we see, yep, brown-eyed kids score better, if we truly believe the idea, there's no reason to question it, right? There's no reason to question why are the brown-eyed kids getting all the good marks. So similarly, if we believe that these people are better and deserving of all of that success and money, then we don't really question it, right? And that's what keeps classism in place. We've talked about these before, these two ideologies of meritocracy and individualism. Both of them also support classism, right? The idea that success is based on your personal talent or achievement or effort, right? Why is Jeff Bezos ridiculously rich? Well, because he worked really, really hard, right? Why am I not rich? Well, I'm not working hard enough, I guess, right? I need to do more to be successful, right? And again, there is some truth to that. If you want to become a heart surgeon, you have to do the work, right? You have to go to med school, you have to study hard, you have to practice. There's a lot of work that goes into that, right? But it's not the only factor, right? Success has a lot to do with other factors in addition to hard work, right? And individualism is the same thing, right? Individualism says that, we're all free to make our own choices, we're all completely independent, and we can do whatever we want. But again, that's not true either, right? Can I wear a dress to school tomorrow? Well, I can. I can, but there will be consequences, right? People will look at me strange, right? Trying to think of another better example for that. People have the ability to make their own choices and behave as they choose. When we read that article about gendered oppression in the classroom by Shavella Pittman, we heard that those women actually can't act the way they want because they are conscious of the color of their skin, right? They're conscious of the way they're perceived by others. And so they may, and how they're perceived as women, right? So they may not be as friendly as they might want to be because they want to be taken seriously as an authority figure. They might not want to bring up racial things because they don't want people to look poorly on them because they belong to a certain race. So we're we're not independent individuals, right? We're connected to society and we're seen in a certain way depending on what social group we belong to. Yeah, and so, the classic kind of idea here is, again, the American dream, right? The idea that Americans live in a classless society where anyone can make it, right? Anyone can just come from anywhere, from any background, and they could be a star. And again, it's a very seductive kind of dream, and it's, in some ways, it's what America is based on, at least mythologically speaking. But in many cases, it's not that true, right? If you look at the United States, anyone who's an American citizen can be president. Okay? You are allowed to run for president if you are an American citizen. Okay? That's how it works. But you can vote to, yeah, you can do it, right? You are allowed to run for president as a US citizen. But why do you say it's impossible? Yeah.
If they've never experienced it, I think they won't make it. So, I think
Well, yeah, and that's the thing, right? In theory, on paper, anyone can be president. If you're an American citizen, you're good to go, right? As long as you don't have a criminal record, and there's a few other things, but basically anyone can. But also not anyone can, right? Because to run for president, you need a lot of money, right? There's a lot of, like, think of all the television ads, the radio ads, the billboards. You've got to tour the whole country and speak at rallies, and you've got to pay to rent arenas to have your rallies in, and there's a lot of money, right? There's millions and millions of dollars that go into. Eunice, can you Google for me, since your computer is there? Can you Google cost of Biden 2020 campaign?
But you say like Justin Trudeau wasn't around. Like he's rich, but he was more like what he was doing.
Well, a little bit. Give me a second here. Did you find it? How much did that campaign cost?
But I don't exactly know the number, but they said the 2020 election is set to finish with 14 billion and spending. CNBC.
Okay. Let's just see. I'm not sure if that's.
I
Okay.
can't really vote, so like I don't really care about the politics yet.
Here we go. Here, this should tell. This will be quite informative. So this is how much money that they raised in order to run for president. So almost closing in on $2 billion, right? That's how much money was donated and spent on trying to get those two guys elected. What's that? All the money was from where? For what? To get them elected. So all of the advertisements, the radio, the television, the billboards, the rallies, the travel, the staff, the pins, the flags, the signs on the lawns, all of that stuff costs money, right? And the money comes from people who donate to the campaign. But look at how much money there is, right? If I'm an American, I'm not, but if I was and I wanted to run for president of the United States, where am I going to find enough people to give me $2 billion to run? I don't know that many people. And the people I do know do not want to give me any money. Never mind $2 billion. Where am I going to find all that money? Where's the average person going to find it? They're not. Right? Not everybody can raise this kind of money. Right? So, yes, you can run for president of the United States, but unless you can come up with, $1 billion or so dollars, you will never be noticed, right? Because these guys have enough money to promote themselves, to advertise for themselves, right? And again, why do they have that much? Well, they have rich friends, right? They know people who own major companies, right? And have a lot of political and financial power. How do they know these people? Well, because they also have political and financial power, right? Joe Biden comes from, a reasonably well-off family, but he's also spent the last 50 years in government, right? He's been rubbing elbows at cocktail parties with all the richest and most powerful people for 50 years, right? These people are now all his friends. Donald Trump, of course, we know his story, right? He's a real estate guy. He's said to be very rich and wealthy. He's certainly got lots of rich friends. And so he's able to raise that money too. But can the average person raise that money? No, right? If I could raise $10,000, I'd be shocked. If the people I know would give me enough money to amount to $10,000, that would be surprising, right? And that's nothing, right? That's nothing. That's no money at all compared to $2 billion, right? So again, yes, anyone can run for president, but you got to know people, right? Like you have to have connections to people up there, right? People with money, people with power, because those are the people who are going to donate and support you, and those are the ones who are going to give you enough money to actually run a campaign, to advertise, to go around the United States and have rallies and speeches and put signs on lawns and all kinds of things. Right? So, yeah, can anyone be president? Sure they can. But really? Not quite. Right? Not quite. Yeah, and so again, these kind of, rags to riches, American dream, anyone can make it. These stories are very kind of sticky, right? People want to believe them and they kind of hold on to them. But if you look here in the US, only 6% of children born to parents in the very lowest economic class will rise to the top. Okay? This is called social mobility, right? If you're born into a poor family, how likely is it that you can raise yourself out of poverty, that you can get a good education, that you can go to university, that you can get a good job? What are the chances that you can do that? In the US, not so much, right? Even though the American dream says that you can, the reality suggests that it's a lot harder to do that than people might think. And in fact, it doesn't happen all that often. And again, if you look at the 10 richest people in the US, they're all white, they're all men. Almost all of them were born into wealthy families, right? They start ahead, right? Just like playing the board game, they start with a bunch of money, right? How easy would Monopoly be if you started with a whole bunch of money rather than just a little bit? Right? And Trump is a perfect example of this. Trump likes to talk about how he's a self-made man, that he, made a fortune on his own because he's so brilliant and so he's such a savvy real estate mogul or whatever he is. But if you look at his history, he comes from a super wealthy family. His dad's company was very successful, a very successful real estate company. His dad loaned him millions of dollars early in his career. Trump inherited that company when his dad died. Trump was a millionaire when he was still in diapers, at least, right? And yeah, he went to all the best schools, right? He went to what's his? I think he went to. I think the name of the university he went to is Wharton School of Business. I think it's about $50,000 a term for tuition.
So expensive.
Yeah. What if you have money and what? As a political leader or just as a person? Well, I don't know. There's still lots of Trump supporters. I don't think he did any good for anybody. But I mean, like he has a real shot of getting elected in 2024. No, he's a disaster, right? Yeah. There, yeah, and that's a complicated question because there's a lot of reasons why the people who support Trump support him. There's a lot of reasons why, and you're right. It's not just because he has money. My point here is that he was able to get in that position because he started out wealthy, right? Because he was rich from the very beginning, right? And he came from a wealthy family. He went to a really good school, which his parents paid for. He started his own business, and his dad dumped a few $1 million into the bank account so that he could start his business career, right? And then he inherited the business, which is worth billions. And so, he likes to say that, I did it all myself, but it's like, well, no, you didn't, right? Like you started ahead of everybody else because you had a lot of financial support and you went to all the best schools, right? Of course you were able to succeed, right? If you gave me $10 million, I'm sure I could succeed too, right? But again, some people start out ahead, right? And again, what about Trump's kids, right? Do you think they went to the best schools around? Yeah, they did, right? They wore the best clothes, they got everything they needed, they went to the best schools. When they needed money for an apartment or for a business venture or whatever, Dad put up the money. Yeah, and that's very helpful, right? when you're trying to establish yourself, or if you're trying to become rich, it's very useful to have lots of money to start out with, right? If you start out with lots, you can probably make more of it, right? And if you know anything about the Trumps, even his daughter Ivanka, even her husband Jared is the same, right? Jared also comes from a super wealthy real estate family. His dad gave him lots and lots of money to start out with. And so, these people like to say that, it's meritocracy, right? I just worked really hard and I was successful. It's like, okay, well, maybe you worked hard, but you also had an advantage, right? You started out ahead of everyone else. And so it shouldn't be too shocking that you got to where you were, right? So for our purpose here, we'll kind of divide society into these things. This is maybe the last thing I'll say today. We'll divide society into these 4 groups, okay? These groups are not hard and they don't have hard lines around them. They're just kind of a way of describing people in society. Okay, so it's just a loose organization. You could divide society up into as many sort of categories as you want, but this is one way of describing it, right? So at the top, of course, we have the owning class, people who inherit a lot of wealth, right? They often have a trust fund. In many cases, they don't have to work, okay? They have enough money from their investments, they own properties. They don't really need to work at all. Some of them might have lower incomes, so if you look at their tax return, they won't make a lot of money, but they have a lot of money invested and stored away, and so their net worth is quite high, even if their income seems small. But it's all investments and stuff that they already own. And again, in some cases, this is inherited, right? It's generational wealth. The next group are, I guess, people in the middle class. Okay, so this is a lot of people who use their bodies or their minds, or maybe a bit of both, and they work for their income. Okay, so they might have advanced degrees, they own homes, sometimes they can pay for their kids to go to university. These jobs used to be called white-collar jobs because they, you would wear like a suit to your job kind of thing. So, doctors, lawyers, managers, teachers probably fit in this category as well, although I don't really wear a white collar, but that's okay. Yeah, that's middle class people, right? Next down are the working class. So these people more oftenly use their bodies than their minds for income, but it's a bit of both still. Sometimes they're manufacturing, sometimes they're delivery workers or cab drivers, people who work in retail, people who work in food service, people who own restaurants or work in restaurants, people who work in factories, people who work in mail and sort of warehouses and things like this. All of these are kind of working class people. So they make a little less, right? Sometimes they have a high school education and then some extra training. Sometimes they're tradespeople like plumbers or carpenters or whatever. Often they're renters, but sometimes they're fortunate enough to buy something. They may not be able to afford to send their kids to university. These are kind of the working class. And then at the bottom we have people who are poor, right? Who are living below the poverty line. They don't have enough money for food or shelter or clothing. Sometimes they rely on government assistance. Sometimes they're homeless, either temporarily or permanently. Sometimes it's minimum wage workers who just don't make enough to get above the poverty line. These people are at the bottom, right? So you can, again, you can divide society up in as many ways as you want, but this is kind of one way of thinking about it. Arad says here, so you mean all of them have privilege? I don't know if you're referring to the Trump conversation, Arad, but yeah, they do, right? They have a lot of privilege, but they also have a lot of power, right? Social, economic, and political. And I mean, if you look, sorry, I'm going back based on that comment, but if you look at Joe Biden has a lot of political power. Now he does, but also he did before. He was a U.S. state senator, and he was President Obama's vice president. He's been in government longer than I've been alive, and so yeah, and so he has a lot of political power, right? And he has some social power too. People know who he is, right? They respect Joe Biden as a person, right? In terms of financial power, probably not so much. I think he's got money, but not really enough to, not like Bill Gates or anything. If you look at Trump didn't have any political power going in, right? Because he had never had a political office, but he certainly had financial power, right? He was a rich guy, or at least he played one on TV. And he had a lot of social power. People always knew who Trump was, right? Trump was a celebrity 20 or 30 years ago. Yeah, he was a big deal. He was a big deal in the 80s. In the 80s, he was kind of everywhere. He was very flashy. He was like the epitome of the successful businessman. That's who Trump was, and he made a big name for himself. He was very kind of showy and out there. And so yeah, people have known who Donald Trump is for a long time. And so in the 1980s, he was this sort of flashy businessman who was building casinos and golf courses and making tons of money, and he was so successful, and he had beautiful wives and all that. In the sort of 90s, 2000s, he was kind of a reality TV star, right? He was on The Apprentice and things like that. And then, you know, he sort of transitioned over into politics here. So Trump had a lot of financial power, but also a lot of social power. People in the West have known who Donald Trump is for decades, right? So, you know, yeah, they had privilege, but they also had power. Different kinds of power, but power nonetheless. Right? Power that someone like me, for instance, does not have. I don't have the financial power. You should see my bank account. I don't have social power. Nobody really knows who I am outside of this building, right? I'm a nobody. And political power, none, right? I don't hold a political office. I never have. Nobody in my family has. I have none of those things, right? Okie dokie. So that's all I have for you today. Don't forget the quiz tomorrow. Again, in-class students don't have to start until 9 because online students, I'll be dealing with you from 8 o'clock until 9, okay? So you get a little sleep in tomorrow if you so choose. Other than that, I think I'll end it here, and I'll let you go, and we'll see you all tomorrow, okay? Coolio? Okay. I'm getting tired looking at your sweater, Eunice.
Huh?
I'm getting tired looking at your sweater.
We sleeping?
Okay, bye people.